During my studies at CMU, I have spent a significant amount of time attending to the ways in which theology and peace-building cannot be thought of apart from each other. The work of peace-building, social healing, and conflict transformation is a deeply relational work. In zones of protracted violence, relations are often characterized by suspicion, fear, and hostility. When we think the work of peace-building with theology as Christian ethics, the ways in which we approach conflict and violence change drastically. Christianity and theology are concerned with relations between God and God's people, relations among people, and between people and creation. Because of this, conflict and violence are also understood as forms of relating, rather than mere social or political phenomena. Of course, there are better and worse ways of relating, relations that foster kindness, humility, and love, rather than malice, arrogance, and hate. Therefore, the approach that Christian peace-building takes towards violent conflicts is the work of decomposing relations of hostility and composing relations of love. These relations of love will look different in different places and between different people. Just as Christianity looks different in Cairo than in Winnipeg, different in Bogota than in Mindanao. Shane Claiborne, in his book The Irresistible Revolution, begins one chapter with an astute observation. If you ask most people what Christians believe, they can tell you. Christians believe that Jesus is God's Son and that Jesus rose from the dead. But if you ask the average person how Christians live, they are struck silent. We have not shown the world another way of doing life. How we do life, how we live. This, I believe, is at the heart of Christian ethics. Rather than understanding ethics primarily as the weighing out of pros and cons or making principled decisions, I think that Christian ethics is essentially concerned with this notion of witness and discipleship to Jesus. When we proclaim the good news of the Gospels, when we confess that Christ is Lord, we also proclaim that Jesus has inaugurated a new world order. What is perhaps most striking about this new creation is the radical change of relations it initiates. We are suddenly called to dine with the marginalized and despicable. We are called to show love to our enemies, even more than to our friends and family. In this new community, the inferior members are valued the most. We can relate to people in many different ways. We have family and friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Even among these types of relations, the degrees of friendship and enmity can vary vastly. Our postures towards people we don't know are also made up of various relations of hospitality and hostility. Our different attitudes towards politicians, public figures, people we pass on the streets, panhandlers, to name a few. Part of what makes us human is our continuous work of composing and decomposing different kinds of relations with others. Christian ethics, then, has everything to do with how we relate to one another, what kinds of relations we compose, and also what kinds of relations we might better decompose to live well in the world, to witness to the life and teachings of Jesus. The work of peace-building that I think is inherent to the work of Christian theology can also take place where harmful relations are less overt. The relations between non-Aboriginal Canadians and Indigenous people is an important example of this. Aboriginal people in Canada, whether rural or urban, are largely alienated from the rest of society. In fact, I suspect that many of us in this room do not know a single Indigenous person by name, let alone consider them a friend. This does not mean that we have no relations with Indigenous peoples. There is always already a relation between people, but this one is often characterized by distance, both physical and mental, as well as stigma, prejudice, and fear. We live in a land that claims to be post-colonial, a land that claims to uphold human rights, freedom, and democracy, a land that commissioned a truth and reconciliation process for survivors of residential schools. And yet this same land maintains the Indian Act, in which indigenous people are counted less than human, and allows these people to live in reserves with poor sanitary conditions and little running water. This begs the question, have we shown the world another way of doing life? One in which the rich, the poor, the noble and the wretched dine together at the Lord's table? One in which we spend ourselves on behalf of our enemies and value most those who are weak and vulnerable? As Leela Watson, an Australian Aboriginal, once said, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Thank you.